Welcome, dear listeners. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to enjoy more original stories every week. The Inspector Price Mystery Series is a trademarked original, available exclusively on this channel. Settle in, the mystery awaits, Death in the Marble Garden. Chapter 1. A Garden of Stone and Secrets. The carriage rolled gently through the Sussex countryside, its wheels crackling over gravel roads lined with old beech trees and ivy-covered walls. Inspector Harold Price, recently returned from a case in Kent, had accepted a rare weekend of leisure at the suggestion of his old school friend, Colonel Arthur Lavington. The Colonel, now retired and living at Penhurst Estate with his sister, had invited Price for a short holiday, promising peace, fine cigars, and long walks through his beloved grounds. As the iron gates of Penhurst swung open, the inspector leaned forward to take in the view. The estate was a handsome one. Tall sandstone walls, mullioned windows glowing in the fading light, and a low haze of lavender blooming around the perimeter. But what caught the eye immediately was the garden. Unlike any English garden Price had seen, it bore the unmistakable mark of a collector's mind, specifically that of the late Lord Adrian Penhurst, a famed antiquarian and archaeologist. The marble statues scattered through the grounds were not reproductions but genuine Greco-Roman artefacts. The garden resembled a shrine more than a pleasure walk. Stone satyrs peered from ivy-covered alcoves. A life-sized statue of Hades and Persephone presided over a granite fountain that never ran. To the uninformed, it was charming. To the learned, unnerving. As Price stepped out, Colonel Lavington strode across the flagstones to greet him. Though older, the man retained his military crispness, erect posture, keen eyes, and a voice that commanded respect. "Price, welcome, old man. Hope the journey wasn't too dreadful?" "Not at all," said the inspector, shaking his friend's hand firmly. "Though I must say, your estate is more museum than home?" Lavington chuckled, though there was a trace of unease in his eyes. "Yes, well, my late brother-in-law was rather obsessive. The housekeeper's still terrified of the statue of Hades." As they made their way through the echoing halls of Penhurst, Price took in the lavish interior, mahogany staircases, gilded mirrors, and endless display cabinets of pottery shards, aged manuscripts, and bronze relics. It was a house that breathed the past, but it did not do so kindly. "I imagine it's not easy living among the relics of the dead," Price remarked. Lavington gave a sideways glance. "Some would say the dead should remain buried." Before Price could ask more, a commotion echoed from the east wing. Rapid footsteps, hushed voices, then the unmistakable sound of someone stifling a scream. The Colonel turned instantly. "That came from the marble garden!" Within moments, both men were striding through the eastern corridor that led directly to the garden's arched entrance. The thick glass doors had been flung open. A housemaid stood there, pale and shaking, her apron crumpled in her fists. "In the garden," she whispered. He's just lying there, sir." They rushed past her. The marble garden, despite its name, was a solemn patch of stone-paved land, encircled by yew hedges and laid out like a miniature forum. Marble statues stood in solemn procession, flanked by stone benches and broken columns. It was a strange place, beautiful but almost sad. Near the base of the Hades statue, half crumpled and eerily still, lay a man. He was not dressed for gardening. In fact, he wore a rumpled ivory suit, now stained red around the chest. A trickle of blood ran from the corner of his mouth. One hand was outstretched, the other clenched tightly around something. Paper, perhaps. Colonel Lavington let out a quiet curse. "That's Professor Alaric Mortensen. He arrived this morning. Dear God." Price knelt beside the body. The man was cold. He'd been dead for hours. He gently pried open the clenched fist and removed a scrap of parchment. It was covered in ink and symbols, ancient Greek, perhaps Latin, and what looked like a partially deciphered code. "A cipher," Price muttered. Lavington stared. He was an expert in epigraphy, translations, cryptic tablets, all that. But why would anyone— The inspector rose slowly, scanning the garden, the statues, the shadows cast by the fading evening light. This wasn't random, Price said. Someone brought him here. Someone knew the significance of this place. The housemaid was still trembling by the door, her eyes wide with fear. I only found him because Cook asked me to fetch fresh rosemary. It grows behind the statue there, she pointed. I saw his foot first, thought it was another statue. A shiver ran through her. I swear he looked peaceful, like he was asleep. Inspector Price looked at the Hades statue, towering above the corpse. Its eyes seemed to glint with malice in the dusk. No, he said quietly. Not asleep. Silenced. Chapter 2. The Curse of Hades. The news of Professor Alaric Mortenson's death spread through Penhurst like wildfire. By the time Inspector Price and Colonel Lavington returned from the Marble Garden, the household was in an uproar. The parlour-maid had fainted, the cook was muttering prayers under her breath, and the butler, Mr. Ridgely, had taken it upon himself to lock the drawing-room liquor cabinet for the sake of decency. The professor's body had been respectfully covered with a linen sheet. A constable had been summoned from the nearby village of Craydon-on-Hill, and Price sent word to Scotland Yard requesting a forensic team for the morning. Lavington poured 2 glasses of brandy in the study, his hand shaking ever so slightly. "You don't think it was a robbery?" he asked. His watch and wallet were still on him. "No, not a robbery," Price said, examining the parchment more closely. The cipher was partially decoded in pencil, with several Greek characters scratched out and replaced by rough English equivalents. A few lines had been underlined but not translated. "There's something personal here, or academic. Perhaps both." Colonel Lavington sank into a leather armchair with a heavy sigh. Alaric was a bit of a recluse, brilliant mind. He once translated an undeciphered inscription on a Mycenaean seal that had baffled experts for decades. But he was also erratic, obsessive. Obsessive about what? Truth, mainly, the colonel replied, and his reputation. He loathed being wrong. Last month he stormed out of a symposium at Cambridge when another archaeologist challenged his dating of a newly discovered bust. He called it academic sabotage. Price stood near the fireplace, where a bronze bust of Caesar looked down with cold indifference. Would anyone have reason to sabotage him more drastically? Lavington frowned. His rivals were vocal but not violent. There was a soft knock. Mrs. Eloise Darlington, Lavington's sister, and the lady of the house, stepped in. She was a woman of fine breeding, tall and composed, her silver hair pinned with precision. Even in shock, she radiated calm authority. "I heard," she said gently. "Arthur, I've had the guests assembled in the music room. I thought Inspector Price might want to speak with them." "Thank you, Eloise," Price nodded. "The sooner I speak to them, the better." The music room was a sunken chamber in the west wing, flanked by velvet curtains and a harp that hadn't been touched in years. A grand piano sat under a stained-glass window, and on every available armchair or chaise lounge, a guest had found a perch, uneasy, restless, whispering. There were 6 guests in total. Dr. Leonard Voss, a barrel-chested archaeologist with a booming voice and a reputation for disdain toward Mortenson's theories. Miss Ivy Penwood, a slender, quick-eyed academic who worked with Mortenson as a research assistant. She clutched a handkerchief in her lap. Mr. Julian Swithin, a sardonic art critic and collector of ancient objects, often more interested in aesthetics than authenticity. Professor Hester Green, a rival epigrapher from Oxford, with a sharp tongue and sharper mind. Mr. Frederick Linley, a young pianist invited by Lady Eloise for entertainment. He looked utterly out of place in the scholarly crowd. Miss Cordelia Mortenson, the late professor's niece and ward, barely 20, pale and ghostly silent. Inspector Price stepped forward and cleared his throat. "I'll speak with each of you individually, but let me begin by saying this. Professor Mortenson did not die of natural causes. He was murdered." The room tensed. Whispers broke out immediately, punctuated by Cordelia Mortenson's sharp intake of breath. Dr. Voss stood abruptly. Murdered? But who? Who would do such a thing? That, Price said steadily, is what I intend to find out. For now, I ask that no one leave the estate. I shall begin interviews shortly. He motioned to the butler. Mr. Ridgely, please prepare the small library for private conversation. As Ridgely left, Miss Penwood stood up, her face drawn. Inspector, I know it sounds absurd, but the marble garden, people say it's cursed. Lady Eloise says she's heard things at night. The statues? They're from tombs. Professor Green rolled her eyes. Ghost stories won't solve a murder, Ivy. Julian Swithin chuckled dryly. Ah, but isn't it poetic? The scholar dies beneath the god of the underworld. Price looked at him. Poetic, perhaps. Convenient, more likely. Miss Cordelia spoke for the first time. He was afraid, Inspector. Her voice was soft but steady. Everyone turned. He'd been pacing for days, muttering to himself, and 2 nights ago, I heard him shouting in his study. When I went in, he said he'd made a mistake, one that might cost him everything. What sort of mistake? Price asked. I don't know, but he burned several documents in the fireplace, and that cipher, I think he brought it here to hide it. Thank you, Miss Mortensen, that's helpful, Price nodded. She looked up. Do you believe in curses, Inspector? No, Price replied, but I do believe in guilt. Just then the constable returned with a message. Begging your pardon, sir, the apothecary came to confirm the wound. Yes? Single stab to the chest, narrow blade, and something else. There was bruising along the neck. The apothecary thinks the professor might have been held in place. Pinned? Price's eyes narrowed. So the killer wanted to be sure he couldn't escape. He turned back to the room. One more question. Did anyone see Professor Mortensen this afternoon? Dr. Voss raised a hand. He took a walk around 4 o'clock, alone. I passed him on the terrace. He seemed distracted. Julian Swithin nodded. I saw him too, talking to someone near the garden. Looked like Ivy. Miss Penwood's eyes widened. What? No, I was in the drawing room all afternoon. Are you sure? Swithin said with a sly smile. Price's gaze moved between them. Already the marble garden was casting long shadows. Chapter 3. Masks of the Past. Inspector Harold Price sat in the small library, its oak-panelled walls and dark velvet drapes giving the room the air of a private confessional. A single lamp glowed on the desk, and beside it a leather-bound notebook, where he recorded each interview with methodical precision. On the mantel sat a curious statuette, an alabaster owl, chipped at the wing, watching like a silent observer of truths and lies alike. He had requested that the guests come one by one, starting with those who had the most immediate connection to Professor Mortensen. The door opened, and Miss Ivy Penwood was shown in. She looked pale and shaken but composed. Her chestnut hair was pinned back, and her round spectacles framed intelligent but weary eyes. Please sit, Miss Penwood, Price said gently. I'd like to talk about your relationship with the late Professor Mortensen. She perched at the edge of the chair, wringing her hands. I was his research assistant, she began. I met him 2 years ago during a symposium at King's College. He admired my work on Anatolian burial inscriptions. I admired his brilliance. He was... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Difficult, yes. Arrogant at times, but a genius. Did you work closely with him recently? Yes, especially over the past 6 months. He'd come across a set of inscriptions. He believed they were related to a missing funerary codex from southern Crete. He spoke of it constantly. He became obsessed. Obsessed enough to alienate others? Her expression darkened. Yes. He accused Professor Green of trying to discredit his findings. He accused me of leaking drafts of his translations. He even dismissed his own niece, Cordelia, from the library one afternoon because she asked too many questions. Price leaned forward. Where were you this afternoon, around 4 o'clock? In the drawing room, reading, with Lady Eloise and Mr. Linley. I never went near the marble garden. I don't care what Mr. Swithin says. He must have mistaken someone else for me. And did Mortensen confide in you recently? He told me, she said slowly, that the translation, if correct, could unearth something dangerous. I thought he was speaking metaphorically. What did the cipher concern? I don't know. He kept it locked in his case. I only saw a corner of it once. He was adamant it not leave his possession. Price nodded. Thank you, Miss Penwood. That will be all for now. As she left, he made a quick note. Motivated, frightened, intelligent, defensive. Could she have been near the garden after all? The next to enter was Dr. Leonard Voss, his booming footsteps echoing off the parquet floor. He greeted Price with a stiff nod. I suppose you'll want to ask the usual, he grumbled, settling into the chair with a groan. And no, I didn't kill the man. Where were you at 4 o'clock? In the reading room. I had a pipe, then napped. Ask Ridgely. He passed me twice. You were once a close colleague of Professor Mortensen? Once is the key word, Voss said with a smirk. Brilliant, yes, but he made enemies faster than he made translations. He had this habit of claiming discoveries that were, let's say, collaborative. Price arched an eyebrow. Did he ever wrong you directly? He undermined a paper I presented on the Antikythera mechanism, said my dating was flawed, humiliated me in front of peers, but we buried that years ago, figuratively. Did you know what he was working on recently? Something about an alternate origin of the Eleusinian rites, Voss muttered. Some theory that threatened to redefine the mythological canon. Nonsense. If it had any merit, he would have submitted it to the Royal Antiquarian Society. But he didn't. That says enough. Price leaned forward. Would you say he was frightened before his death? Frightened, Voss frowned. No, paranoid maybe. Kept looking over his shoulder. He thought someone was following him in London. Said his letters were being opened. Foolish talk. As Voss left, Price wrote, bitter, openly hostile. Claims indifference but speaks in barbs. Strong build, could have overpowered victim. Alibi partial. Mr. Julian Swithin strolled in next, cane in hand, cravat tied just slightly, too flamboyantly, for the countryside. His smile was sly, his eyes roving, never resting too long. Delicious business, isn't it? He said. All this drama among the relics. Price ignored the remark. You claimed you saw Miss Penwood near the garden. I said I saw someone like her, Swithin corrected with a twinkle. It was from a distance. Could have been Miss Mortensen, I suppose, or someone in a similarly dull frock. Price regarded him evenly. What were you doing in the garden? Sketching. The light was perfect, and the statue of Persephone is quite evocative at sunset, if you believe in such things. Did you speak with Professor Mortensen today? He passed by, muttering as usual. He didn't see me. Looked like he'd seen a ghost. Julian leaned forward. Inspector, I'll tell you what no one else will. That man was being blackmailed. I overheard him in the study last night, whispering to himself. Not again, he said. Not this time. I won't be ruined twice. Did you see any letter? Any visitor? No, but I did find a scrap of burnt paper in the grate this morning. Had the word retraction on it. I took it for kindling. You've a curious sense of priorities. Only the dead warrant reverence, Inspector. The rest of us are just players. After Swithin came Professor Hester Green, sharp-faced, no-nonsense, and dressed in academic black. She sat stiffly, arms folded, eyes narrow. Let me save you time, she said. I loathed Mortensen. He plagiarized, he lied, and he slandered those who called him out. But I did not kill him. Did he plagiarize your work? No, he published a translation of a Cretan tablet in 1918. I found out later he'd copied my unpublished notes. By then, the damage was done. Did you threaten him? I wrote him a letter demanding a public apology. He never replied. Where were you at the time of death? Sketching by the East Terrace. Alone, unfortunately. You'll find no one to vouch for me. What do you think of the cipher? I haven't seen it, but if he was hiding it, I imagine it was something very valuable. The remaining 2 interviews were brief. Mr. Frederick Linley, the pianist, knew little of the scholarly drama. I was playing in the drawing room for Lady Eloise and Miss Penwood, he said. I only met Professor Mortensen last night. He barely acknowledged me. Miss Cordelia Mortensen was still in shock. She sat silently for long moments before whispering, "He was like a father to me, but colder. He had demons, Inspector, guilt over something he never spoke of, something from before I was born." "Did he ever mention a threat or danger?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, a month ago he told me, if anything happens to me, find the key beneath Persephone. I thought it was a metaphor." Inspector Price sat back thinking. Persephone. The statue across from where Mortensen had been found. The clue was right there. He closed the notebook and stood. That evening, as dusk fell again over the marble garden, Price returned alone. He approached the statue of Persephone. At its base, overgrown with lavender, was a small loose slab of marble. He pried it open gently. Beneath it, wrapped in oilskin, was a small black notebook, Mortensen's cipher journal, and inside scrawled in nervous handwriting, "They know. The betrayal is deeper than I imagined. If they find this, I am already dead." Chapter 4. The Widow's Tears. The next morning dawned damp and grey. The marble garden had been cordoned off. Constable Bray from Craydon-on-Hill stood guard with a visible discomfort, whether due to the chilling presence of death or the unsettling silence of the garden. Price couldn't be sure. Back inside the estate, the inspector sat at the breakfast table with Colonel Lavington and Lady Eloise. The other guests had opted to take their meals in their rooms, a decision Price did not discourage. It gave him time to sift through the cipher journal. Price went over the notebook. It was filled with pages of fragmented translations, snatches of ancient Greek, Latin phrases, strange diagrams, and partial word groups. Sacred seal of Eleusis, not intended for mortal translation. Initiates swore eternal silence. The rites twisted by Roman hands, buried truth lies with the child. Retribution follows the broken vow. Price tapped the page with his finger. "These aren't just notes," he murmured. "They read like a confession." Lady Eloise was dressed impeccably in mourning grey, despite not being related to the deceased. She poured tea into a china cup with deliberate care, her composure betraying none of the chaos that had unfolded within her home. "Is that the journal you uncovered?" she said without looking up. "Yes," Price replied evenly. "It was hidden beneath the Persephone statue, just as Cordelia claimed." "I always told Arthur the marble garden would bring us nothing but trouble," she said quietly. "It's beautiful, yes, but it was never meant to live here, in England. It belongs to another world." The Colonel grunted. "Come now, Eloise, it's just stone." She ignored him. "My husband loved that garden. He believed in the sacredness of things long dead. But Adrian was a man who believed more in gods than in men." Price sipped his tea. "Tell me, Lady Eloise, did you know Professor Mortensen well?" "Not particularly. He had been here before, twice, I believe, years ago. He corresponded with my late husband. Adrian admired him, though I confess I never did. I found him cold, arrogant, and something about him seemed hollow." "Did he ever argue with anyone during this visit?" "No shouting matches, if that's what you mean," she said. "But there was tension. I believe he and Professor Green exchanged sharp words after dinner on Friday, and Dr. Voss made several rather barbed remarks over port last night." "And Miss Penwood?" Lady Eloise raised a brow. "Devoted, too devoted perhaps. She hovered around him like a student around a cult leader. But I suspect even she had grown tired of his moods." Price paused, then asked, "What of Miss Cordelia Mortensen?" Lady Eloise set her cup down carefully. "She is a sweet, thoughtful girl. Lonely, I think, and very much under her uncle's shadow. He used to correct her in public, her pronunciation, her historical knowledge. Once even mocked her for misquoting Homer. It was cruel." "Was there a strain between them lately?" Lady Eloise hesitated. "Yes, I overheard a conversation in the library 2 nights ago. She asked him about her parents, about her mother. He became agitated, told her to never speak of it again. She left in tears." Price leaned back. "Did she ever speak of it to you?" "Only once. She said her mother died when she was very young, but that no one had ever told her how." that her uncle had forbidden it. The colonel stirred in his seat. I recall something now. Years ago, Mortenson's sister, Cordelia's mother, was involved in a scandal in Athens. Some affair with a fellow there. Then suddenly she was gone. Died mysteriously, I think. Price's eyes narrowed. A forgotten affair. A mother erased from memory. A forbidden cipher. And a body left at the feet of Hades. It was beginning to feel less like a murder and more like a reckoning. After breakfast, Inspector Price requested Miss Cordelia Mortenson be brought to the conservatory, a bright room filled with potted orchids and filtered light. She entered quietly, arms crossed, hair still damp from the morning's fog. "I'd like to speak to you again," Price said gently. "About your uncle." Cordelia sat, gaze distant. "You mentioned he was afraid." "Yes." "What was he afraid of?" She hesitated. "I'm not sure, but he told me recently that the past has a way of returning when you least expect it. That time buries secrets, but never destroys them." "Was he speaking of something specific?" Cordelia looked up, her eyes glistening. "I think it had to do with my mother." "Did he ever tell you how she died?" She shook her head. "Only that it was an accident, but I've always felt there was something more, something shameful." "Do you believe your uncle loved you?" There was a long silence. Then Cordelia said, "I think he tried. But he didn't know how. He raised me like one of his artifacts, under glass, studied, polished, but never understood." Price paused, then carefully placed the cipher journal on the table. "Have you seen this before?" She stared at it. "No, I haven't. It contains fragments about the Eleusinian mysteries, about initiates, about silence. Do those words mean anything to you?" Cordelia looked up sharply. "The mysteries were sacred rites in ancient Greece. No one knows what happened during them. It was forbidden to speak of them, even under threat of death." Price nodded. "Your uncle seemed to believe he had uncovered something hidden, something worth killing for, or dying to protect." Cordelia's voice trembled. "Do you think someone killed him because of what he found?" "I think someone killed him because of what he knew." She stared at the notebook. Then she whispered, "He said I wasn't ready to learn the truth, that some truths rot the soul." "Do you want to know?" Price asked softly. She looked at him, eyes shining. "I have to." Later that afternoon, Inspector Price returned to the marble garden. The mist had lifted, revealing every vine, every crack in the stonework. He circled the statue of Hades slowly, mentally reconstructing the crime. Mortenson had come here willingly, or had been brought. The cipher was with him. He had either planned to hide it or confront someone. But why here? Why beneath the god of the dead? He looked at the position of the body again, carefully marked by chalk and flagged with police tape. Then he turned to the statue's pedestal. A faint groove ran along the side. Discoloration, perhaps, or something had been there before, but now looked removed. What could it have been? A plaque? Price thought. He turned quickly and called for Constable Bray. "Check with the house staff. Ask if anyone noticed a plaque missing from the Hades statue. Bronze, likely." "Right away, sir." And then Price added, "I want a search conducted of the guests' rooms, discreetly, especially Professor Green's." He returned to the study, his mind working furiously. Something had been taken from that statue after the murder. Something symbolic or incriminating. And somewhere among the guests, someone knew more than they were saying. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Hallways. By the time Inspector Harold Price began his evening round of questioning, the Gainsworth Gallery had fallen into that peculiar hush that comes when the day's bustle has ended, but the lights have yet to be dimmed. Price liked this hour. It was when the veneer of civility often slipped, when people, tired and unsettled, let things show in their eyes or their tone that they might have guarded more carefully in the bright light of morning. He strolled the length of the east corridor, where the scent of fresh polish still clung to the parquet flooring. Here and there, the gas lamps glowed in small pools of light, casting the paintings in alternating swaths of gold and shadow. Somewhere far off, a clock chimed 7, its sound carrying faintly through the halls. From behind a partly opened door came the murmur of voices. Price slowed his step, moving just close enough to catch the cadence of conversation without revealing his presence. "I told you, it's too dangerous now," a woman's voice whispered sharply. "And I told you," came a man's lower-clipped reply. "We've gone too far to turn back." The sound of papers being hastily shuffled followed, then the squeak of a drawer. Price eased back a step and waited until the door opened. Clara Winslow emerged, her face pale but composed, clutching a leather folio to her chest. She started at the sight of him. "Inspector, I thought you'd left for the day," she said quickly. "I found myself with a few more questions," Price replied mildly, his eyes taking in the way she kept her grip on the folio. "Were you speaking to someone just now?" Her eyes flickered. "Only Dr. Keating. He wanted to discuss some upcoming acquisitions." "Ah, acquisitions," Price smiled faintly, but his mind noted the tremor in her voice. "If you should recall anything about last night, anything at all, please let me know." Clara gave a short nod and slipped away down the corridor. A turn later, Price found Lord Anthony Blackwell standing alone in the small sculpture gallery, his long fingers idly tracing the base of a marble bust. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. "You seem very much at home here, Lord Blackwell," Price said conversationally. Blackwell's thin smile returned. "Art is the only home worth having, Inspector. These pieces endure. People do not." Did Harcourt share that sentiment? The collector gave a soft, humourless laugh. "Harcourt was a craftsman, not a visionary. He lived in service to the work, but he lacked the, shall we say, imagination to understand its greater value." "Greater value than artistic merit?" Blackwell's eyes glinted. "Art's value, Inspector, lies in what people will pay for it. You of all people should know how greed and beauty make such a potent pair." Price let the words hang in the air. Blackwell's candour was striking, but so was his careful avoidance of anything resembling an alibi. In the service corridor near the rear entrance, Price found the night watchman, Mr. Hale, polishing the brass latch of a heavy door. Haley was a wiry man in his late 50s, with the cautious manner of one used to walking dark halls alone. "You were on duty last night?" Price asked. "Aye, sir, from 10 until 6. "Did you see Mr. Harcourt after the gala?" "I did, sir. Around 11:30 I saw him near the side entrance. He was talking with a man, tall, wearing a black cloak. Thought it odd, but I was too far to see his face." Harcourt seemed agitated. "And did they enter the building?" "I believe they did, sir. They went toward the private viewing room. The door closed behind them. After that, I didn't see Harcourt again." Price's eyes narrowed. That made two witnesses, the boy Alfred and the watchman, who had seen a cloaked figure with Harcourt, and both had placed the meeting near the side entrance. Returning to the main gallery, Price paused before a smaller alcove. On the wall hung a painting of a Venetian canal, but the space to its right was conspicuously empty. The frame hook was still in place, and the faint square of unfaded wallpaper suggested that something had recently hung there. He called Wilkes over. "What was here?" Wilkes consulted a small ledger. "A seascape, sir. Fishing boats at dawn. Not one of the more valuable pieces, but it's in the storeroom now." "Why was it removed?" Wilkes frowned. "Not sure, sir. No one logged the change." Price's mind ticked over. A missing painting, however minor, in a gallery already under suspicion for forgery. It was another loose thread to tug. It was nearing 8 when the first sign of real action came. Price was in the main hall when the sharp sound of metal scraping on metal echoed from the west wing. He moved quickly, Wilkes at his side, rounding the corner just in time to see a figure in dark clothing bent over the lock of the small archive room. "Stay where you are," Price's voice rang out. The figure bolted, darting down the narrow hall toward the service exit. Wilkes gave chase, but the intruder knew the building too well, slipping through a side door into the rain-dark street beyond. By the time they reached it, the street was empty. Inside the lock, Price found a broken bit of metal, a fragment of an old key, snapped in the attempt. He compared it to the brass key Alfred had given him earlier. Not the same, which meant there were multiple keys in circulation for restricted areas of the gallery. As the gallery finally fell silent for the night, Price walked once more through the main hall, his gaze lingering on the Madonna and child, the smallest finger on the child's hand bent inward. The initials, faint but deliberate, Harcourt's cryptic ledger entry, truth confirmed. He was beginning to see it now, not the entire picture, but enough of the outline to know what kind of crime he was chasing. Harcourt had uncovered more than a forgery. He had stumbled upon a calculated operation, one that likely involved more than one person, and had been running under Sir Lawrence's very nose, or perhaps with his quiet consent. But what gnawed at Price was the sense that whoever had killed Harcourt had not finished their work. The break-in tonight proved it. There was still something in the gallery worth stealing, or hiding, and until he found it, Harcourt's death would remain only part of the story. Chapter 6: Portrait of a Killer. Inspector Price reviewed the mounting puzzle spread across the low marble table before him. Papers, excerpts from Professor Mortenson's cipher journal, transcriptions from the plaque, and fragments of guest interviews were arrayed like clues on a chessboard. Price was not alone. Across from him sat Constable Bray, who had just returned from the village. A deep crease had formed across the constable's brow. "We managed to speak to an old professor at the British school at Athens," Bray said. "He knew Mortenson back in 1906. Told us Mortenson had had an affair, a woman named Amelia Stanislopoulos. She was a scholar too, but far less known. Rumour has it she died suddenly. Officially, it was an accident. But unofficially, well, it was scandal." Price leaned forward. "What kind of scandal?" "An affair with another archaeologist. She became pregnant. The man disappeared. The family sent her away. Then, just after the child was born, she was found dead at the foot of a cliff." "Was there an investigation?" Bray shook his head. "The case was closed quickly. Local authorities assumed suicide." "And the child?" "Adopted by her brother, raised in England." Inspector Price closed his eyes for a long moment. Cordelia. So that was the great secret. Cordelia Mortenson was not Alaric's niece, but his daughter. Alaric created the whole story about Amelia being his sister to be saved from scandal. That evening, the storm had broken. Inspector Price found himself once more in the gallery hall, a long corridor between the east wing and the study, lined with portraits of the Penhurst family and their acquaintances. He stopped before a newly hung painting. It hadn't been there the previous day. The portrait was oil on canvas. A woman seated in profile, dressed in Grecian white, with dark hair coiled at her neck. In her lap rested a journal, and behind her, faintly painted, was the silhouette of a Doric temple. It was signed A. Stanislopoulos, Athens 1907, Amelia Stanislopoulos, and as Price gazed upon the features, the sharp nose, the high cheekbones, the large luminous eyes, he realised with jarring clarity that he had seen this face before. Cordelia, not similar, identical, a daughter hidden in plain sight. Price summoned Cordelia to the gallery room. She arrived moments later, pale, her hands trembling at her sides. "You found the portrait," she said. "I have. I discovered it in a storage room 2 days ago," she continued, voice tight. "He never told me it existed. I hung it here to confront him. I wanted to see if he'd react. He didn't. He barely looked at it." "Did you know it was your mother?" "I suspected," she whispered. "But he never said her name, never showed affection, just control, coldness." Tears welled in her eyes. "I always knew there was something wrong. Something no one would tell me. He treated me like a secret." "And you confronted him?" "I did," she said. 3 days ago. He denied everything. Said I was imagining things. That the past was better left untouched." "Did he threaten you?" She nodded slowly. "He said if I ever pursued the truth, I'd lose everything." Price felt the weight of it all pressing in. The journal, the cipher, the plaque, the secrecy. And now, motive. But something still didn't fit. Mortenson had feared the truth getting out. But who had been most threatened by that truth? Who had the most to lose if Cordelia's parentage were exposed? He returned to the cipher journal and flipped back through the final pages. Among the scratched notes and half-translated phrases, he saw something new. A name, written once, then crossed out heavily. Julian. That night, Inspector Price paid a visit to Julian Swithin's room. He knocked twice, no answer. He knocked again. Still silence. Finally, with a nod from Colonel Lavington, he used a spare key and opened the door. The room was neat. A travel bag was packed. A train schedule rested on the desk. And on the bureau lay a slim leather case. Inside were sketches, dozens of them. Portraits of Cordelia, portraits of Amelia. One of them, disturbingly, depicted the Hades statue, with Mortensen lying beneath it, blood blooming across his chest. Dated the day before the murder. At the bottom of the stack lay an unsigned letter. Price picked it up and read, "I warned you once. I will not be erased again. The girl deserves the truth, and I will see to it that she receives it, one way or another." Below the message was a press clipping, folded and yellowed. "Tragedy at Eleusis. Young scholar found dead near temple grounds. Lover suspected, never found." And scrawled in pencil at the edge of the article, "Julian S." Price moved swiftly. Within the hour, Julian Swithin was located in the wine cellar, a lantern in hand, his travel coat on, and a small case under his arm. He raised an eyebrow when Price appeared with the constable behind him. "Well," he said dryly, "I had a feeling this would come." "You were leaving," Price said flatly. "I was," Julian admitted. "This house is no longer inspiring." "Did you know Amelia Mortensen?" Julian smiled faintly. "Everyone knew of her." "I mean truly know her." A pause. "Yes," Julian said. "Years ago, before she died. Before Alaric took her away from me." Price stepped closer. "You were the lover." Julian looked down. "Yes, and I would have married her. But Alaric destroyed everything. He erased her, took the child, rewrote the story. You wanted to expose him. He was a coward, hiding behind history and ink, and he would have buried her forever. I couldn't let him win." "Did you kill him, Julian?" "No," Julian said, "but I confronted him, in the garden, the night before he died. What happened? I told him I knew, that I would tell Cordelia everything. He laughed in my face, said no one would believe me, that he had already rewritten the past." Julian's hands clenched. "I wanted to kill him, but I didn't. I left him there, alive, arrogant, and the next morning he was dead." Price studied him carefully. There was grief in his voice, but no guilt, not yet. Back in the study, Price sat with the evidence one last time. The cipher, the plaque, the journal, the portraits, the press clipping. It was all falling into place, and yet there was one thing still missing. One person who had said too little. One person whose silence, ironically, was now the loudest sound of all. Ivy Penwood. She'd found the letter. She had access to the journal. And she had motive. A woman scorned, perhaps, or a daughter betrayed. Inspector Price felt it then. The shift, the final piece turning in the lock. And with it, the face of the killer was no longer a mystery. Chapter 7. Blood in the Dust. The following morning dawned with an eerie stillness. Inspector Price stood in the drawing room, hands clasped behind his back. The house's occupants, now little more than suspects, were gathered before him, seated stiffly on high-backed chairs, their expressions a palette of fatigue, tension, and fear. Colonel Lavington stood by the window, arms folded, while Lady Eloise observed from a distance, a porcelain cup of untouched tea, trembling faintly in her hand. Miss Cordelia Mortensen sat by the hearth, her face pale but unreadable. To her left sat Julian Swithin, posture composed, but eyes clouded with an emotion far more personal than guilt. Ivy Penwood was seated nearest to Inspector Price, her usual composure marred by visible strain, cheeks flushed, eyes darting between guests. Dr. Voss, Professor Green, and Mr. Linley were present too, though all had adopted the guarded detachment of those who hoped the spotlight would pass them by. Price began. I thank you all for your patience and cooperation over the past 2 days. As you know, Professor Alaric Mortensen was murdered, stabbed in the chest in the Marble Garden sometime late Saturday afternoon. From the outset, this case has been unlike any I've encountered. It was not merely a murder, it was a reckoning, a culmination of secrets buried beneath layers of lies, ambition, and shame. But at last, the dust has settled. He paused and let the silence expand. The answer to this mystery, he continued, does not lie in the deciphered cipher, nor in the stolen plaque, nor even in the scandal of Cordelia's birth, though all are important threads. No, the answer lies in who had most to lose if Mortensen's true character were finally revealed. He turned slowly and faced Ivy Penwood. You were his most loyal assistant, devoted, quiet, in the background. But you knew more than you let on. Didn't you, Miss Penwood? Ivy stiffened. I was loyal, yes, but I didn't. You did, Price said firmly. You killed him. A collective gasp rippled across the room. Cordelia turned sharply. Julian's face tightened. Voss muttered something under his breath. Price stepped closer. You see, it wasn't about scholarship. It wasn't even about betrayal. It was about possession. You believed you knew Mortensen better than anyone. You saw yourself as his confidant, his intellectual equal, even, his heir. But the arrival of Cordelia, grown, curious, and increasingly determined to uncover the past, threatened that. You feared she would uncover the truth of her parentage. He dismissed your ideas, took credit for your contributions. You loved him, but he used you. And when you found the letter, the one where he wrote that Cordelia must never know the truth, you realized that he had chosen someone, and it wasn't you. Ivy's face was ashen. You confronted him in the garden, Price said. He likely dismissed you, perhaps even laughed. You carried the cipher journal. You demanded recognition. He gave you nothing. Price moved toward the desk, lifting a bronze paperweight. You picked up something like this, something narrow, heavy, pointed, a sculptor's awl perhaps. And when his back was turned, you drove it into his chest. Cordelia covered her mouth. Julian reached for her hand. Price continued quietly. You thought he would die quickly, but he clutched at you. You grabbed the cipher from his hand. You left the scene, but not before you tore the plaque from the statue to stage the scene. Make it look ritualistic. You knew just enough of the Eleusinian myths to construct an illusion of ancient vengeance. Price paused. And then, in a final act of cruelty, you hid the plaque in Professor Green's luggage, knowing she would be blamed first. Everyone stared at Ivy. Tears welled in her eyes. I didn't mean to kill him, she whispered. I only wanted him to finally see me, to say my name, to admit I mattered. She turned to Cordelia. You have no idea what it was like, watching him parade you around, his niece, while I was buried in manuscripts. I gave him my life, my youth, and he never once. She broke off, voice cracking. I found the letter, and I realized that even in death she, your mother, was more important to him than I ever was, and you were going to inherit everything. His name, his work, his memory. I couldn't bear it. Price signalled to Constable Bray, who stepped forward gently. Ivy rose, stunned, as though waking from a dream, and allowed herself to be led out of the room. She did not look back. After the silence settled, Cordelia turned to Price, voice trembling. Did he ever love me, even a little? Price hesitated. I think he did, but he loved his secrets more. Cordelia nodded slowly. Julian Swithin stood. She deserves better, he said quietly. She will have it, Price replied. That evening the household began to relax. Guests began planning their departures. The clouds had broken, and soft amber light spilled over the damp stones of the marble garden. For the first time in days the air felt breathable. Inspector Price stood once more beneath the statue of Hades. The garden had been washed clean, but the earth beneath it would remember. As he turned to leave, he passed the statue of Persephone and noticed, at her feet, a tiny purple crocus blooming through the cracks. Life, once more, from the silence of the past. Epilogue. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived for Inspector Price, posted from Cambridge. It was from Cordelia Mortensen. Dear Inspector, thank you for everything. I have begun studies in classical languages. I've been accepted into a program in Athens, my mother's city. It feels like the right place to begin again. I've enclosed a copy of my first article. It's called The Forgotten Daughter. I hope one day you will read it. Price placed the letter gently into his file beside Mortensen's journal and the final photograph of the marble garden. The case was closed, but the past, Price had learned, never truly rests.